So I'm David Pooler. I'm a professor of social work at Baylor University, and one of the things that I've been studying really intensely over the past decade, but even I would say going all the way back to 2011, is adult clergy sexual abuse. Now, Amy's story, this person isn't just purely a clergy person, but I would call them a religious authority. And so I'm going to sort of speak, I'm going to kind of tie in some of the work that I've looked at, some of the things I've learned in my research, to sort of speak to and kind of have a conversation with kind of what Amy has just shared. And ideally, I'm going to wind up in time for you all to interact with both of us. So you can ask her questions, me questions, both of us questions, and we'll try to respond. So we want to save a few minutes for that. I did create a little PowerPoint to just keep me on track to walk through some things. One of the other things I would just say about my experience is that I am a researcher, I'm a social scientist, but I'm also a clinician, so I have a part-time practice. And honestly, it was 4 years ago in 2021 that I opened my practice up to survivors who've been abused by a religious authority or clergy person. And that sort of additional learning just by working clinically with people has sort of been a real integration with the research that I've done. All right, so this is what I'm calling my little part of the talk here: religious authorities and betrayal in therapeutic relationships. But I think I just want you to kind of get the fact that this is slightly broader than that, and you're going to hear things that probably have intersected with other presentations and some of the keynotes. Like all of the nature of being at this conference is so much of the information is sort of being integrated and connecting, we're threading things through, so you'll just see that show up here. James Baldwin says, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." So what are we facing? This isn't all we're facing, but I think in particular with Amy's story and with some of what I study, these are some of the factors at play. Now let me just also make a note, right? I'm talking about adults who are abused. And it's kind of it's a different configuration than what we often see when priests are abusing children, who are often male, but not exclusively male. Girls are abused too. But when we start looking at adults who are abused, we start to see some different configurations. And so this is part of what I'm going to talk about. So deeply rooted in our systems and structures, right? Both in our society and our religious structures, and it's not exclusively Christian, and we see it kind of everywhere. But it's patriarchy, we see misogyny, we see clericalism. I'm going to talk a little bit about what that is. Gender dualism, that's kind of a result of both of those. And ultimately, lessening and denigration of women and sexual abuse. So let's just go back and, let's go back to the, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries for just a moment, right? Augustine says, "Woman was merely man's helpmate, a function which pertains to her alone. She's not the image of God, but as far as man is concerned, he is by himself the image of God." So right, we already see this elevation of men and a denigration of women. Pope Gregory I, "Woman is slow in understanding, and her unstable and naive mind renders her, by way of natural weakness, to the necessity of a strong hand in her husband. Her use is twofold: animal sex and motherhood." Right? So I'm just saying, and unfortunately in 2025, some of these same ideas and beliefs and views are still deeply held and entrenched in many of our religious systems and in society. So what does this lead to? A philosophy professor at Baylor kind of shared this with me, and I thought, I really kind of like the explanatory value of this mind-body dualism, this male-female opposition. And part of the reason I bring this up is because I think this is kind of explains some of the environment in which abuse occurs. So with men, right, it's thinking, it's the mind. With women, it's about the body. With men, it's reason. With women, it's emotion. Men, it's thinking. Women, it's feeling. Men are strong, women are weak. Men are active, women are passive. Men are aggressive, women are submissive. Men have autonomy, but women are dependent. Men have self-interest, it's me. Women are supposed to be selfless. So let's talk about clericalism, because there are a lot of isms that are in society and the church, but clericalism is the one ism that belongs solely to religious spaces and places. And here's some ways that we can think about clericalism. It is an elevation and prioritization of the message, goals, and ideas of a religious authority to the exclusion of laity and their goals, wishes, and priorities. Right? So it's kind of this built-in, hidden weight. It's just kind of in the air about how we are to function and how we are to view those with a religious authority, whether it be a priest, pastor, therapist, whatever, imam, rabbi, right? You name it. So they are elevated, and others who are not that are diminished. And the fact is, then, a religious authority can benefit from this arrangement, right? They can use that power whatever way they want. And I'm going to talk about it a little bit. Power in and of itself is neither good nor bad. But here's the thing. Those of us who are not priests, pastors, rabbis, are socialized to believe that dissent and pushback and holding people with religious authority accountable is just not acceptable. And those of us who are Christian, and even Amy got at this, it's like, it's not Christian to sue or to hold someone accountable. It's like, that's not what Christians are supposed to do. There's a lot of that sort of built into the DNA of kind of thinking in religious spaces. Right? Those people who are religious authorities or leaders who are abusive, they can feed off of these kind of environments, right? What it does is it gives them freedom to steer and control narratives, and they can get overwhelming support from people in the face of information that suggests, hey, something is awry here. Likewise, when clericalism is present, which it is, and where it's unchecked and unacknowledged and unnamed, congregants are less likely to trust their own instincts. You've heard a lot of that in Amy's stories, right? We don't want to rock the boat, and we will often carry to our own detriment the shame of an institution or a perpetrator. And part of this is that non-compliance to these kinds of cultural norms has a very high risk, right, of being excluded or losing someone's approval, especially an authority figure. Unfortunately, religious institutions are so safe for predators and abusers because they seek them out. It's because one of the reasons they seek them out is so easy to remain undetected. And connecting with Amy's story, a therapist or a counselor who's working in a religious setting or sanctioned by, kind of this religious space, that this is the place where this church sends people, or we trust this person implicitly, right? They have enormous power and protection of the institution. So religious institutions will prioritize, again, we kind of have this continuum here, right? Image versus reality, surface versus depth, escape and avoidance versus pain and grief, power, powerful versus the powerless, dishonesty versus the truth, authority in one person versus sharing that power, control versus autonomy or agency, right? So we see this in our religious spaces. So I just wanted to put this up again, just having some sort of use for explaining and helping us frame, how a story like Amy's happens. The fact is, because of our current patriarchal structure of religious institutions, when we're talking about adult clergy sexual abuse or abuse of adults, we're really talking about religious authorities that are heterosexual men, and most of the victims are women. I know there are other configurations, so don't hear me say that other kinds of configurations don't exist, but this is predominantly what we're talking about. So it's primarily female victimization by men with power. So when a religious authority abuses someone, they target them and groom them by blurring boundaries and making sexual activity seem okay. And I don't even need to go into detail on that. You heard replete examples of and Amy's right. I mean, in the stories that I hear, so much of even how a pastor would abuse someone is really very similar. They will enmesh with their target, isolate their target from others, including their spouse. They often criticize their support system. Like, the people you have in your world are inadequate, including their spouse, and kind of elevate themselves as the answer. Like, I have what you need. I know what you need. I'm the one you should rely on. And they often make the target feel indispensable by letting them know how important they are to their emotional support. So I see that a lot in a lot of, I'm better when I'm with you. I have more insight from God when I'm with you. When I'm in your presence, I feel amazing. And some versions of that. The target, though, feels like, if I'm going to say no to this, because this person is telling me how important I am, like, I'm saying no to God, or God's will, or God's plan. This is from Brene Brown. You put Brene Brown, didn't you? Yeah, I want to quote her too. So, when the culture, right, of a church, a religious structure, whatever, mandates that it is more important to protect the reputation of that system and those in power than it is to protect the basic human dignity of individuals, you can be certain of these things. Shame is systemic. Money and power are more important than ethics and people. Accountability doesn't exist. Control and fear management tools, and there is a trail of devastation and pain. All right, I said this earlier, but power is neither good nor bad, right? It can be used to welcome the marginalized, excluded, or wounded. Power can protect and support people. Power can advocate for those in need, right? That's the way I would hope power is used. When I say this, like, who's vulnerable? Or who's vulnerable to abuse? Well, anyone who's trusting in religious authority. The moment you place trust in religious authority, if they choose to misuse that power to injure somebody or exploit someone, there's going to be harm, right? So there's enormous risk. So again, there's not some profile necessarily of who is vulnerable. All of us are vulnerable. Anyone's vulnerable when we trust. And it feels like we should be able to trust, right? That's part of the tragedy here. So French and Raven, all the way back in 1959, developed a model of understanding power, social power in particular. But this kind of starts to help explain how someone can have the kind of influence and how they can center themselves in someone's world in much of the way that Amy was describing, right? So let's just walk through some of these. Someone has legitimate power, right? A license, a medical license, a credential of some sort, ordination. They're a therapist, they're a priest, right? They have legitimate power because of their actual position. They have informational power. They have maybe knowledge or information, right, that someone else doesn't have. In many spaces and places, they have reward power. They can punish you or reward you. They have that power. Maybe in Amy's case, it's not so much there was sort of reward or punishments that were tangible, but there were probably more emotional and spiritual, if you will. And it kind of bleeds then over into what we would call coercive power, where someone can offer their approval and disapproval. And I can tell you, when we kind of hitch this up with clericalism, right, that approval and disapproval factor really has an impact on people. Also, there's this personal power that someone has in this configuration of social power, what we would call expert power. That's where clericalism also kind of has a connection. Or referent power, or charisma power, where we might want to emulate this person, or we just want to defer to them because of that. And then they also can have moral power, assess our spiritual lives. And you can see in this case, Amy's therapist was also assessing her spiritual life. So you can see all these, and this is what often society and even religious leaders don't understand the kind of power they actually have. And so part of what we need to be doing today in 2025 is having more conversations about what power is and how power is used. I know that at least in sort of the evangelical world, if you will, the Bible doesn't use the word power very much. So it's like, well, that's not something we need to talk about. So let's talk a little. Amy also talked about consent, right? I'm just going to say this. The person who has more power is always responsible for setting and maintaining boundaries that keep people safe. And it can always be expressed by everyone. There should be no fear, right? There should be overwhelming, absolute freedom to say yes. But the fact is, when there's a power differential, right, you cannot rule out that coercion, undue influence, or exploitation were not involved in that case. Because of clericalism, right, a religious authority can use their own power to amplify that power differential even more and use it then to control the person. And I will say this, clericalism is everywhere. In my observation, it finds a very special and cozy home in a couple of places, evangelicalism and Catholicism. Now, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but it's so obvious in those spaces. Right? Amy talked about gritting. You heard some of the specific tactics, but these are any behavior that an abuser uses to blur and break down boundaries to sexually access someone. And they will often use all these things, religious language, religious principles, and ideas that are really familiar to the targeted person. And really what they're doing is they're convincing this person not to trust themselves or their instincts, but rather to defer to and trust the authority figure. And I've seen this in my research. Abusers are super patient, and they will take as much time as they need to erode boundaries and defenses. It can easily be a year before like explicit sexual activity occurs. Amy hit on this, right? Perpetrators are identifying some basic human needs, right? These are all normal. We all want belonging, validation, to feel important, to have a sense of connection, or feel special, right? And a therapist would be especially adept at that. So if a therapist decided to use their power to sexually abuse someone, they can easily do it. Right? A perpetrator tests and blurs these boundaries until they have access to the person. The end goal is really often about control. Yes, it can be about sexual gratification, but it's as much about control. And I have seen this when person who's controlling and having sexual access to someone senses that something's changing, they often go into bullying and intimidation, verbal abuse, and other kinds of things. I'm going to speed myself up just because we're only about 17 minutes from the end of time. I want to have time to interact with y'all. So let's talk a little bit about intermittent reinforcement. And Amy hit on this earlier, right? So it's the delivery of a reward at irregular intervals. And we know this is a potent kind of reinforcement. A person develops higher tolerance for stress. And part of it is that when it's only good some of the time, right, we start tolerating more stress, more and more stress. So when it's good, it tricks the person into thinking the relationship will be okay. Like, oh, okay, it's okay again. And they begin to minimize and sort of downplay the concerns that they may have had. It's really insidious. The other thing is we have some dopamine spikes with this potent reward, right? And again, I just sort of identified that victims can downplay their concerns, especially when positive reinforcement is happening. And they start wondering what the key is to getting this sort of abusive behavior to stop. They start thinking, what can I do to stop it? Is it me? Is it them? Should I do something different? Should I say something different? Should I wear something different? And I would just say this, the question isn't, why does someone stay? We should completely move away from that and be asking, why did a religious authority feel entitled to abuse somebody? So let's talk briefly about coercive control, which is another factor at play in these kinds of abusive relationships. This is about isolating and dominating someone to control them and getting them to comply. They're often not physical, it's about threats or withholding approval, right? And when used by a religious authority that God showed me or God told me or the Holy Spirit informed me, I call it sort of the God card. Like, what do you do? It's like there's almost nowhere to go, because all of a sudden you're now disagreeing with and saying, God didn't show you that. Like, we're so socialized not to do that. And the religious authority ultimately starts creating a story and narrative about how reality should be perceived and how a victim should perceive themselves. Patrick Carnes talks about betrayal attachment. It's an attachment to someone hurting us. The victim gets consumed with the betrayer to try to make them less abusive, and it results in a diminished capacity to stop interacting with them. Jennifer Fry talks about betrayal trauma. So it's when, basically someone that we're relying upon really violates trust. There's a profound injury as a result, almost always resulting in PTSD. And also going along with this is what she calls betrayal blindness. We exhibit a lack of awareness, not knowing, and forgetting. Institutional betrayal, Darbo was talked about earlier in another talk, but deny attack, reverse the victim and offender, right? So this is when the institution fails to respond adequately when the abuse is reported. And so you kind of got a mixed bag, but it's just such a mixed bag, there's probably more curve than anything helpful, right? But part of the reason is bystanders in that system want to side with the perpetrator. It's the easiest way to manage their own dissonance, and it can because it can shatter their view of God, reality, themselves, others. All right, this is just from my survey. I just wanted to show you this. The church was helpful when I reported the abuse. Look at that. Because there is no surprise in this room. You all know, right? The church or denomination thoroughly investigated the report. So, in my study of survivors of adult project sexual abuse, 60% were being counseled. At least that's the way it was being framed by the perpetrator. 100% of them had PTSD symptoms. 39% had PTSD, screened positive for PTSD. And this PTSD score, 7 years post-abuse, was still in clinically significant range. The only reason I bring this up is the injuries are profound, deep, long-lasting, and abiding. I'm going to actually speed through this. I want to take a little time to interact with you all. Yeah, okay. So, I'm right here at the end. Justice is so largely absent, right? So many non-protected bystanders. Too much benefit without giving the leaders. Betrayal, blindness, choosing not to see, aligning with power. There's a lot of theology that amplifies and normalizes self-sacrifice and suffering, right? And sort of like, well, you're hurting, oh good, I guess God wants you to. I mean, it's really awful insidious stuff of weaponizing forgiveness, and in fact, is churches are not qualified to investigate the allegations that happen in their space. Here's a few things. All right. Okay. All right. You can just look at that. I'm not even going to, y'all can just see this real quick. Because I think having a little bit of conversation is more important than this. Although healing and justice are tremendously important. But here's some things we need to do. We need to center human dignity, respect, autonomy, inclusion, seeking to understand, right? Justice work is ongoing, learning, healing, self-reflection, admitting when we're wrong, righting wrongs, right? Here, I just wanted to show you, there's a few researchers in this area specifically studying kind of abuse. If anyone wants a copy of this, I'll be glad to send it to you. I'll give you my email. I know some of you are like, oh, no, that's fine. There's some specifics here, but in references, but I'll give it all to you. All right, ask away.